Coming up on this episode of the Hey Friends podcast, I would even go so far as to say if you have not had a hard conversation with someone, you need to question how real of friends you are.
Starting with the conversation, he's like, hey, I don't want to have this conversation with you. The only reason why I'm having this conversation with you is because I care for you. And I don't want you to get hurt, you know?
So speak the truth to one another, but you need to think about, is the way and the content and the tone in which I'm speaking these things, is it intended to harm or is it intended to benefit and build up and encourage?
Hey friends, welcome back to the Hey Friend podcast. We're so happy to have you here today. All right, Ben, let's get straight to it. What are we talking about today?
So last episode, we talked about having real conversation with your friends and the importance of kind of going beyond the surface level chit chat. If you want to develop real friendship with someone, you need to have talks about the real stuff of life, which is increasingly uncommon in the world. This episode, we want to go I'll call it a level deeper than that and go from real conversations to having hard conversations.
And hard conversations, sometimes hard conversation can mean is you don't want to have that conversation.
Yes, yeah. And that would be a common thing. It's usually when we're saying hard conversation, we're not necessarily meaning it's something bad that you have to talk about. It could be a positive thing. But it's something that you're like, man, it would be easier if I didn't have to bring this up.
Yeah.
That's what we mean by hard conversation.
There we go.
And that could be a negative thing. That could be confronting someone about something. We're not going to talk this episode about confronting a friend who's in sin. We'll save that for a future episode because I think that deserves a little bit bigger treatment. What we're going to talk about just generally is what are some things to think about and why is it valuable and important to have hard conversations with your friends? Any thoughts in general on that before we jump into the Bible?
We sometimes think if you think it's easier to not have that hard conversation, it's not.
Yeah.
Things will just get harder. And then we apply that with all areas in our lives. You know, it's easier for me to have a hard conversation with a sibling than a friend sometimes,
Sure.
you know?
Yeah.
And we know there's different levels with having hard conversation with people.
Mm-hmm.
But I do believe like this is one of the things that we should practice of having a hard conversation can mean that, hey, I'm also helping build this person up, right?
Yeah.
I'm also looking out for my friend's blind spot, my wife's blind spots, my siblings' blind spots. And having a hard conversation can save headache and trouble for a friend or for someone that you love. So
yes. Yeah. And here's one of the things. I was just Wednesday mornings, we have a cohort of young adults who I help lead. And we had a really good conversation with the folks who were on that call about the importance of having some of those hard conversations, particularly in the context of a team of people where you're working, in this case, a ministry team. But how do you have, the need to not just say, well, we're not going to talk about that, but to actually talk about the issues, not necessarily like direct conflict, but just sometimes there's hard stuff. I would even go so far as to say, if you have not had a hard conversation with someone, you need to question how real of friends you are, because that either means you don't feel safe bringing real stuff up to them, or vice versa, they don't feel safe bringing it up to you. And two, like how you have not tested your friendship, right? Like you can have a board or something like that looks really strong, but when you step on it, if it's brittle, it's going to snap, and you don't know the actual strength of something until you test it. So if you haven't had a hard conversation, you got to say, man, do we have a real friendship, or are we actually like hiding from each other?
That's what I was going to say, hiding from each other.
Mm-hmm.
And some people have said, not having a real conversation with a friend doesn't mean that they're your real friend.
Yeah.
Can mean that they're not your real friend.
Yeah. It's not a guarantee. I mean, you can have real friends and you just happen to get along really well, and you don't have any places where you rub up against each other. But the reality is, and we'll talk more about this in a little bit, humans just are different. Yeah. And if you're different, you're going to have hard conversations. So here's what we wanted to have central to this. I don't think we've actually done an episode where we've had a specific text of the Bible as a central thing, but I think this passage from Ephesians does such a good job of like kind of framing how you have these hard conversations and why it's valuable. So this is from Ephesians 4:25. So the Apostle Paul's writing to the Ephesian church, and he has some really good stuff to say to them about hard conversations. I'll read this. It's 25 through 32 in Ephesians 4. Therefore, having put away falsehood, let each one of you speak the truth with his neighbor, for we are members of one another. Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger, and give no opportunity to the devil. Let the thief no longer steal, but rather let him labor, doing honest work with his own hands, so that he might have something to share with anyone in need. Let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up, as fits the occasion, that it might give grace to those who hear. And do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, by whom you are sealed for the day of redemption. Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with malice. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, as God in Christ forgave you. Any observations you want to make about that, man?
Practicing this, living this out, can be hard. Can be really hard. But we are aiming to be more like Jesus, living as he did, and as he is.
Yeah. And that's where Paul concludes it. He says, be compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as God in Christ forgave you.
Yeah. And also, like, this doesn't say, I think from a worldview of having a hard conversation sometimes means making this person feel small.
Mm-hmm.
It's not saying that.
Yeah.
This is really extending what he's extended to us.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm seeing.
Yeah. Here's something I want to point out. I don't remember when I first observed this or if I learned it from someone else, but studying through this passage, first Paul says, put off falsehood.
Yep.
And speak truthfully to one another, because we're all a part of the same body. So, right, here's the assumption is, right, that the tendency is, as humans, to put on falsehood and not speak truthfully to one another.
Quit faking it.
Yeah, Paul's saying, like, hey, you need to not be false to each other. Don't put on a false face towards the people in the body of Christ, because you're one body, right? Like your stomach doesn't lie to your head about it being sick. Your foot doesn't lie to your mind about it being injured. If it does, that means there's something wrong with your body. But man, how often do we in the church, in relationships and community, fake it towards each other? And there's actually, I'm pissed off at you, but I'm not going to say anything about it. And there's a whole lot. Like, I think oftentimes we do that with like good motives, like, oh, I don't want to stir stuff up, or like I don't want to make them feel bad or whatever. But Paul is pretty direct. He says, take off that falsehood and put on the truth and speak truthfully to one another. And here's the thing that I find particularly interesting in this passage. The next sentence he says is a quotation from the Old Testament. In your anger, do not sin. Which is like, that seems like a weird flow of thought. Like, put off falsehood, speak truthfully to each other. We're all members of one body. And in your anger, don't sin. So why? I read that and I'm like, why, Paul, are you talking about anger now? And the only connection I can think of is like he's assuming that if you're putting off falsehood, speaking truthfully to one another, people are going to get angry, which is like at least in the Midwest where we're at in Fargo, North Dakota, like there's I think there's this implicit belief that if someone gets angry, you must be doing something wrong.
Yeah.
Like if someone in the church is angry at someone else in the church, someone's sinning.
Sometimes we forget that the Lord gives us this emotion. And sometimes we feel these emotions, and sometimes we express these emotions. And that does not mean that all the time that is bad.
Yeah. Yeah. So Paul's assuming that like when we begin to speak the truth to one another, there's going to be emotions that are going to rise up. And probably part of that emotion is going to be anger, right? And I've experienced that. You've experienced that, where someone says something to you, maybe well-intended, maybe not well-intended, and just it rises up in you like, oh, that makes me angry. I do not like I don't like the fact that you just pointed out that thing about me that I don't like. And I'm angry that you saw it, or whatever.
And sometimes when we're angry, Paul also says this too, like, no unwholesome talk, only what's helpful for building each other up.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
when we're angry, I think when it's bad is when we're angry and we tear this person apart
Yep.
with our words, with our
Yes.
act, how we're saying it,
Yep.
and how we responded to it.
Yeah.
But instead, he said we can be angry and build this person up at
Mm-hmm.
the same time, and we can say words that can build them up. So
Yeah. And that goes, I think that's a balance too of where he says, speak, put off falsehood, speak truthfully. And you can, depending on your personality type, there might be some people, I'd probably be one of these people who would be like, I could take that too far and be like, well, that just means I'm supposed to say everything I think and everything I feel. And I'm just being truthful. I'm just being honest with this person. But Paul qualifies that both for the person who's maybe feeling that anger and feeling the temptation of responding and kind of striking back at the person who said something they don't like, and the person who he's calling on to speak truth is saying, but also you need to evaluate. Here's what he says, like, do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. So speak the truth to one another, but you need to think about, is the way and the content and the tone in which I'm speaking these things, is it intended to harm or is it intended to benefit and build up and encourage?
And lastly, it's like forgiving each other just as Christ,
Yeah. And what's the assumption there? The assumption is that if you speak the truth to one another, someone's going to get angry, even if the other person does it in a kind, loving, with the intent of building up.
Yeah.
The assumption is there's going to be hurt feelings and you're going to need to forgive and give grace to each other.
And then the assumption also is like what you're saying is they may not receive it well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think so there's another passage where that's often cited in the way of this kind of having hard conversations that Paul also writes. I'm forgetting which epistle it's in, but it's, the statement is that speaking the truth in love. And what oftentimes that people will take that and say, or at least I'll say it this way, the way I often heard that kind of taught or just assumed that this is what it was meant is like, if I speak the truth in love, the other person's not going to have their feelings hurt. And if their feelings are hurt, that meant I didn't really speak the truth in love. Like if they leave that conversation angry, I must have failed at speaking the truth in love. And instead I just spoke truth and there wasn't love involved. Which if we're looking at this, that's definitely not what Paul is assuming. Paul seems to be assuming that like you're going to have to forgive each other after you take off falsehood and speak truth.
When should you forgive each other?
That's a good question.
Every
time?
Is it every time? Is it right away? Is it go to bed and wake up? Well, don't go to bed.
In this passage, he says, don't let the sun go down while you're angry and do not give the devil a foothold. So I think the call for us, if we're and this is all kind of preliminary to us talking about practically how you have these hard conversations. I thought this passage is a great like foundation piece for this. I don't know if that necessarily means like, man, I had conflict with this person. I literally can't go to sleep until we feel good about each other. But I think what it does mean is that you, in your heart, you need to forgive the other person, and otherwise you're giving the devil a foothold. So I think the call is immediately, and right, you got the Holy Spirit's working on your heart. I've definitely had those conversations where I got angry at someone who said something to me, and I was like, "Arr." But then 20 minutes later, after I had kind of those emotions had cooled down, I was like, well, actually, they were right. I didn't like the way they said it or whatever. I didn't like the fact that it was said, but they were right.
And sometimes something you might say and you didn't say it wrong and you said it as kind as you can, as nicely as you could, and they still don't receive it well. And you expect me to apologize for saying something hard, or you expect me to ask for forgiveness, I think that can get weird sometimes too.
Yeah.
Even like, if a friend's having a conversation with someone and the way they responded was like, from a prideful perspective or from a perspective like, no, that's not true. That's not happening. Well, it is happening. Here's what it is. And like, they do it in such a kind of way. And at the end of it, they're mad and you're just trying to really love them. And really try to love them and have this hard conversation. You don't feel comfortable having this real conversation with this person or this hard conversation with this person, but you're doing it because you love them, but they might not receive it.
They're not responding well.
No. Yeah. And I'm supposed to ask for forgiveness at the end of it, or
Yeah.
Is it?
I think what Paul is saying there is not that you as the person who's spoken the truth is called to forgive.
Okay.
Well, I guess you would need to forgive the other person for their responding to you in anger.
Yeah.
Not in the sense of like, I don't think you don't want to leave that conversation with the other person. You spoke something at like the scenario you're framing up where you said, hey, I just want to lay this out to you, and they blow up. I don't think you want to be like, I forgive you for getting angry about this as you leave. Like that's not what Paul said.
Don't.
But I think you maybe in your heart you need to say, what, I'm not going to hold that against them that they got angry about that, because the reality is it may be that they are angry in the moment, then they leave, and like I mentioned, I've experienced and I've had this happen with multiple friends where I've had hard conversations with them and left not on great terms, and a day later or 2 days later they come back and say, hey, you know what, I was angry about that, but you were actually right, thank you for saying that to me. That's not what always happens, but I think that's what Paul is trying to point the Ephesian church towards, is like, hey, if we speak the truth to one another, people are probably going to get angry, but there's grace in that. That doesn't mean to stop speaking the truth, and where it lands, the end goal is what we're talking about at the start of this episode, is it begins with imitating Christ. Absolutely. Forgive one another just as Christ forgave you. Love one another. Confront one another as Christ confronted you.
Yeah. And I think sometimes it helps with starting with the conversation. He's like, hey, I don't want to have this conversation with you. The only reason why I'm having this conversation with you is because I care for you. And I don't want you to get hurt, and just being vulnerable at the end, like, I don't want to do this, and continuing the conversation where it's going to go, So like, what does that look like to live this out?
Yeah. Practically, how do you do that? Because it's great, right? It's great to be like, oh yeah, thanks. The Bible says that. Awesome. Now what? So let's do this. I think a couple practical things. One, start with a clear end in mind when you're coming into those hard conversations. Some of these points we're going to mention are drawn from, or kind of summarized from, I think it's one of the best books out there on practically how do you walk through a hard conversation. It's a book called Crucial Conversations.
That's a great book.
Fantastic read. Highly recommend it if you're a book person. And if you're not, you can go on YouTube and search for Crucial Conversations and find some great videos talking through the book. But one of the things they talk about there is start with the end in mind. Say, what is my end goal of this conversation? So let's do this. Let's have maybe pick two scenarios. I'll take the scenario where, let's say, and this is something that actually happened to me multiple times when I was in college living with other guys. I'm a fairly clean person. My wife might disagree with that. Sorry, Kelly, if you disagree with that. But compared to many other guys, I'm a clean person, at least in college. So I had a couple roommates who would, they'd leave stuff lying around. Dishes would be pot, like literally stuff would be molding in the dish drainer, whatever. So there was multiple times where I had to have some of these hard conversations around, like, hey, can you like not leave your dirty underwear on the bathroom floor? Or like, can you wipe up the pee that when you miss the toilet, whatever, stuff like that. It's funny as a parent now, like, these are all things that my kids do. So let's have that as one scenario.
Yep.
Then why don't you take a scenario of like a group of friends?
Yeah. If you have a group of friends and they are hanging out, and you're one of the ones that you're one of the ones that just finds things out at last minute, or you're one of the ones that just like doesn't know what's going on, and you just feel like, man, I'm not part of this group.
Yeah, like, do they not value me?
Yeah.
Or like, what's going on?
Why am I the one that's always finding things out last?
Yeah.
So,
yep. So in the case of the scenario I'll take for these examples, beginning with the end in mind, starting with here's the goal. I would need to evaluate, okay, if I've got my friend Justin and he's making our apartment messy, not cleaning up after himself, I want to have a conversation about this with him, because I'm starting to it's been 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, and I'm frustrated about this, and I don't want to be pissed off at him. I want to deal with it and be honest, do what the Apostle Paul is saying. I need to say, what's my goal in this conversation? Is my ultimate goal, I want a clean apartment, and if Justin is not in the apartment, the priority is I want the clean apartment? Or is my priority actually that Justin would learn some skills about keeping his space cleanly, because that's going to be beneficial for him in the long run? Or maybe it's, man, what I want to do in this conversation, my end goal is I just want to communicate to my roommate that like what they're doing is impacting me. and I'm not necessarily worried about change in this conversation. Depending on the relationship, you might need to have like some incremental goals. You might need to say, man, realistically, this is going to be like 16 conversations with this roommate to get them to the point where they're cleaning up. So that'd be one example of beginning with the end in mind, saying, what's my goal of this conversation? Probably if I'm throwing my mind back to the actual times where I've had to do this, the goal was more like, hey, I want this person to develop some skills that they didn't learn growing up, because it's going to bless their future spouse. If they get married, it's going to bless their future roommates. I want to help them live a better life where there's not mold growing in their apartments.
Yeah. And from my perspective of being left out, a friend that's being left out, I think a lot of that times of being, if you're someone that's like your friends are hanging out and you're not a part of the times they're hanging out, or you're finding it out at last, sometimes it has to deal with a lot with you. Like, hey, going to them, say, hey guys, I feel left out. I feel like I'm the last one. Just communicating, hey, here's what's happening. Here's how I feel, right?
Yeah.
Or there's the other side of just like, hey guys, is something going on? And if something going on, because here's what's happening. What's happening is I don't feel included. I don't feel invited to the things. Is there something happening? And it might be just misunderstanding. I was like, no, I thought we had you in the group chat. I thought Lindsay
I've
let
had that
you know.
happen before.
Yeah. And sometimes it's so small.
Yes.
So if we hold that in for a long time, then we have this perception, oh, they're mad at me, oh, they don't like me, so I'm going to start hanging out with these other people. And then we make this story in our head, and it's not totally true. And friendships get ruined by that.
Yeah.
It gets ruined by that. So if something's coming up right away, just bring it up. And if it just has to deal with you, hey guys, here's how I feel. And sometimes it might change just by saying, here's how I feel. Or sometimes, hey, add me to the group chat. There's action items that you can.
Practical action.
Yeah.
Yeah, which that hits on the second point too, is that you not only do you want to start with the end in mind when you're going into that conversation, but so that would be pre-conversation. When you start that conversation, frame the statements to be about you rather than accusations towards them. If you come into the example I'm saying and be like, dude, Justin, you are so late. Like, why are you so lazy, man? Why do you make things so messy?
Yeah.
That's a totally different conversation.
That's how you make someone feel small, though, too.
Versus saying, hey, man, I've noticed our apartment's been pretty messy the last few weeks. And for me, it's kind of frustrating to have to be moving stuff around or whatever. Make those statements that you're starting those conversations off with about how you're feeling impacted.
Yep.
And specifically feelings is a great way to start. Like, man, I feel stressed out when this apartment is messy. Can you help me with that?
Yes.
Or the example you're saying, like what you were saying, like, hey guys, I feel like I'm feeling left out of this group. What that does is that it's both you taking a risk and being vulnerable and honest, like the Apostle Paul calls us to, about here's what's really going on in my heart. Here's how I'm feeling. And it also doesn't frame it as an accusation towards them. It gives them the chance to explain.
There is also times, and I don't see this happening a lot, but this does happen. Let's not talk about this too, of you do open up. You do say, here's how I feel, and then they don't respond well at all.
Yes.
And then sometimes that could end a friendship too.
Yeah. Yeah, like, oh, you're accusing me of me, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. And they show you their ugly side.
Yeah.
And sometimes that can scare you,
Yeah, it's easy to shut down and run away from the hard conversation when you get a response like that.
Yeah. And you have to realize at moments like that, it's not you.
Yes.
It is not you.
Yeah. That is a statement about what's going on in their heart.
Yep.
And probably their fear of whatever, like if let's say that I'll just keep running with the name Justin, because I don't know why I just picked that one. That was not the name of any of my roommates. Let's say Justin responds like, oh, how can you accuse me of making a mess in here? Or like, they start blustering or whatever. That's more of a statement about the state of his heart than it is about even his value of his relationship with me. Maybe he's really self-conscious about the fact that he leaves that mess and he's wanting to do better, but he keeps forgetting or whatever. And that kind of leads to the third point that we'd say. So number one, start with a clear end in mind. Number two, frame your statements to be about yourself rather than accusations for the other person. Number three, you got to seek to understand in that conversation rather than taking it as a personal offense when they respond that way or when they start making excuses, which is probably what will happen. Most people are going to make excuses for their behavior because that's how we operate as humans. That's what happens right away in Genesis once sin enters the picture. Excuses come flying in.
Ask questions.
Yeah, ask him questions. Like in that conversation with Justin, he might say, "Man, okay." If he's getting frustrated, he's like, might purely say, hey, like, why is it often messy around here? Like, why do you leave your stuff here? And you have to, that's not a great way to frame it. You got to think about, how do I frame this in a way that's not like a demeaning question?
And sometimes asking questions is also clearing up of like, no, that's not what I said. Here's what I said.
Yes.
Do you understand that?
Yeah.
But even saying that sometimes can be like, what do you think? I'm dumb. I can't understand what you're saying. So it can get really messy, but just like really like your heart to seek, how can I understand what this person, where this person's really coming from?
I honestly want to know your perspective.
Yeah. Are you seeing the same thing? Mm-hmm. That's why we're having this conflict. Like, I'm seeing this, you're seeing this. That's why there's conflict there. Yeah. But are you seeing the conflict? That's where when you're trying to seek for understanding, is that really.
Yeah, and a key piece, I'd say the final, there's more we could say about having hard conversations, but I'd say the final piece you need to do for sure is suspend your judgment. Because if you make judgment up front about other people's motives, we kind of already mentioned this, but it's going to cripple your ability to have the hard conversation. If I go to that conversation with Justin with the story in my head of, man, he's lazy, he's messy, and he doesn't care about the people around him, that's going to come out in my tone of voice. That's going to come out in the questions I ask. And if I, as much as possible, can submit my heart to Jesus and do what the Apostle Paul is saying in that Ephesians thing, and say, I want to build this up, I'm going to be kind and compassionate towards Justin. Compassionate meaning I want to understand his perspective. I'm going to suspend my judgment and assume there's legitimate reasons why he's operating the way he's operating. That's going to enable me to have that hard conversation and give him grace like I'm called to, because God gave me grace about thing after thing after thing.
And really if that conversation doesn't go well, that's sometimes when we don't want to give people grace.
Yeah.
So in moments like that, if it goes well, it's easy to move on and go to the next thing. And maybe you might have to have a conversation again.
Yeah.
But really giving grace in those hard times is really reminding yourself, like, man, extend whatever he extended to you, so, and the judgment part too, we're talking about something small right now. Like, we're talking about things that are, whether it's a roommate or whether it's friends not hanging out, but bigger things too, of just like us judging. What do you think about this? You can quick response here. What do you think about like someone that's a Christian, someone that's not a Christian? Are we supposed to judge both of them the same?
Definitely not. I think we cited this passage in the past. In 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about sexual sin and like that we're not called to judge people outside the church.
Yep.
So I think that's pretty definitive. But not judging someone does not mean you don't have hard conversations with them. A lack of judgment would be, hey, I'm not condemning you as a person, and instead I'm going to say, I honestly want to understand and know you and care for you and love you for your good.
That's how that's how we're going to end it right there.
Yeah.
If you have a roommate, or if you have a friend, or if someone,
coworker or whatever
that is, and you need to have that hard conversation, this is a sign that you should do that. We hope this podcast has helped you to equip you to go first and read Ephesians, right? Ephesians
4,
right? And practice that. Do that.
Speak the truth in love.
There we go. All right, friends. We'll see you next week. We love you, and thanks for listening. Peace. Hey, friend. Thanks for listening. We're all about equipping you to pursue real friendships. You were not created to be alone, because life is just better with real friends. Let's get started.